If one can disprove that Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion, disprove that he bodily rose from the grave, you can disprove all of Christianity. Wow. Recently, I've been doing research on the resurrection and found more compelling evidence for the resurrection. So let's look into the timeline of these events, these resurrection claims, and we'll realize that these claims go back all the way to the cross. Are you up for the challenge? Well, before we go any further, take a moment and like and subscribe to this video and to this channel. It really helps the channel when you subscribe. Most scholars of the New Testament, Christian and non-Christian, will accept the following New Testament books, New Testament letters that were written by the Apostle Paul. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Even Bart Ehrman, who does not accept the resurrection of Jesus, accepts these books as written by the Apostle Paul. And all the New Testament scholars in this field are pretty much all on the same page. That is, that these books are all authoritative. The Apostle Paul was a top Hebrew scholar. He was changed by the message of Jesus, and he knew the other eyewitnesses who witnessed the life, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. And these letters that are accepted by both Christian and non-Christian New Testament scholars as officially Pauline outline the death, burial, and resurrection. We have early manuscripts from Paul. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul was writing around 55 AD. And here's what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 15:1. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. So Paul was with the Corinthians. And then sometime later, he wrote it down. The question is, when did Paul come to the city of Corinth? Well, Paul came to the city of Corinth between the years of 51 and 52 AD. We know that because the New Testament mentions a city leader who was in control of Corinth, and an inscription has been found by archaeologists with this leader's name on it. These city leaders, or these state leaders, were chosen for one-year terms, and it's known that this leader was in control of Corinth between 51 to 52 AD. So if Jesus died in 30 AD, he told the Corinthians this message roughly 22 years after the resurrection. But as you will see, we can get even closer to the historical fact of the resurrection and historically to the resurrection. What did Paul say to the Corinthians? 1 Corinthians 15. For what I receive, I pass on to you as first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. Paul is telling them what he was told. Naturally, we have to ask, when and from whom did Paul receive this information? Paul received this material in 35 AD. And this date is accepted by both non-Christian New Testament scholars and Christian New Testament scholars. So here's a timeline. The cross, 30 AD. Paul had his experience of meeting the risen Jesus on the way to Damascus, which was between 2 to 3 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Paul says in Galatians 1:16, remember, Galatians is one of those New Testament letters that's accepted by the vast majority of New Testament scholars, Christian and non-Christian, as authentic Pauline letters. In Galatians 1, Paul writes about knowing Jesus, and then after he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, he did not immediately go to the apostles. Galatians 1:16, to reveal his son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. My immediate response was not to consult any human being. After Paul's conversion, he went to Arabia for 3 years, headed back to Damascus, and then went to Jerusalem, where he met with Peter for 15 days. Galatians 1:18 and 19. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas, That's Peter. And stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. Now let's read Galatians 2. Remember, early manuscripts did not have chapter breaks or verses in them as a continual thought in Galatians 2. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. Paul went to Jerusalem to make sure they were all on the same page. And they were. And then in Galatians 2:6, another just reminder that this is one of the authoritative letters accepted by all. Galatians 2:6, they added nothing to my message. They were on the same page. The message was the same. So the timeline, the cross, 30 AD. Paul comes to the Lord, 32 to 33 AD. Paul went to Jerusalem, 35 AD. Paul went back to Jerusalem a second time, 48 AD. So far, we have been looking at about 5 years after the cross when Paul talked with the apostle Peter and the dates after that. Now let's see where the evidence leads with getting the timing to the cross. In the New Testament, we have creedal statements. Creeds are shared beliefs that were to be recited. Remember, after Paul met Jesus, he eventually made his way to talk with Peter and James, the half-brother of Jesus. If Peter and James gave the message of the death, burial, and resurrection to Paul, they obviously had it before Paul had it. There are some early creeds. 1 Corinthians 15:3 is an early creed. It has 2 stanzas, and it is written in such a way in Greek that it was easy to memorize. So these creeds were first spoken in Aramaic. That's the language spoken at the time, and then later written down in Koine Greek. But let's look at part of one of these early creeds. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 5. For what I received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. In the Greek, this full creed has 2 stanzas and written in a way that is easily memorizable. Why would they want them to be easily to be memorized? And the answer is because most of Jesus' audience, roughly 90%, were illiterate. So what do you do when you teach someone who is illiterate and you want them to teach others? Well, you tell them stories, you tell them parables, you give them short, pithy statements, sayings they will memorize, like turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, so to speak. These creeds, these sayings were originally spoken in Aramaic, as I mentioned, and then they're written down in Koine Greek. And as you read through these New Testament letters, it is clear there's a style change, a method to get the reader's attention and to help the audience memorize these early creeds. The reason we know these creeds were early, around the time of the cross, is because of how they read stylistically. It is a limited number of stanzas, and it is a way to know what the early apostles were teaching. So, Paul received the message from Peter and James, which means Peter and James had it before then. Someone had to get it from the events of the death and the resurrection of Jesus, so the message could then be turned into these pithy statements, these creeds, and the common person could memorize them. Arguably, the world's leading New Testament scholar on the resurrection is Dr. Gary Habermas. And he says that virtually no scholar, Christian or non-Christian, disputes that the early disciples believed they had experiences with the risen Jesus. So, we have these creeds, these pithy statements in Paul's letters, statements that logically goes back to the time of the cross and then was written down. After Jesus rose from the dead, the early Christian church started growing. Not only that, the apostles, all of them were martyred except for one, if I'm not mistaken. They were martyred for their faith, for what they believed, that Jesus is Lord. You don't go to your death for a lie. Also in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, if you can disprove the resurrection, you can disprove all of Christianity. What? What? You don't write statements like that if you're making something up, if you're making a religion up, especially because Paul wrote that approximately 22 years after the resurrection of Jesus, meaning there were still eyewitnesses alive to debunk the resurrection. There's still eyewitnesses to say, no, what you're saying is a fabrication, but that didn't happen. With these creedal statements going back to the time of the cross, with believers willing to die for their belief in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and with the strong and bold statement that disproving the resurrection can disprove Christianity, it all points to a strong case that Jesus bodily rose from the grave. For more on this and more content like this and to follow our family's journey, be sure to like and subscribe, because as you subscribe to our channel, it really helps out our channel.